It's March 1944, and the air around you is thick with humidity, so dense you can almost drink it. The temperature hovers around 112 degrees, and sweat pours down your face despite the fact that you've been standing still for the past 10 minutes. Your uniform clings to your skin, rotting from the moisture. On your back, you're carrying 72 pounds of equipment, weapons, ammunition, rations, radio equipment, medical supplies. It feels like you're hauling 2 fully loaded suitcases through the densest vegetation on Earth. Your rifle weighs heavy in your hands. Around you, the jungle is alive with sounds, the screech of unseen birds, the buzz of insects, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Could be a monkey, could be a snake, could be a Japanese patrol. You're 200 miles behind enemy lines. The nearest Allied troops are days away through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced jungle explorer. There are no roads here, no supply lines, no reinforcements. If you get wounded, there's no field hospital waiting. If you catch malaria, and you probably will, there's no comfortable bed to recover in. You eat what gets dropped from the sky, assuming the supply planes can find you through the jungle canopy. You drink water from streams after treating it with tablets, praying you don't get dysentery anyway. You sleep on the ground, if you sleep at all. And every single day, you know that somewhere in this green hell, there are thousands of Japanese soldiers hunting for you. Welcome to the world of the Chindits. Between 1943 and 1944, thousands of British, Indian, Gurkha, Burmese, and West African soldiers volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. They would march hundreds of miles into Japanese-occupied Burma, living entirely off air-dropped supplies, and wage a guerrilla campaign behind enemy lines. They would face not just a determined enemy, but also some of the most hostile terrain and climate conditions any Allied soldiers encountered during the Second World War. They would suffer casualty rates that would shock even hardened commanders, and they would leave behind a legacy that remains controversial to this day. This is the story of the Chindits, Britain's deep jungle penetration force, and their extraordinary operations in the heart of enemy territory during World War II. To understand the Chindits, we need to understand Burma. While the European theatre grabbed headlines and Hollywood's imagination, Burma became known as the Forgotten War. The soldiers who fought there called themselves the Forgotten Army, and with good reason. Resources flowed to Europe and the Pacific. Media attention focused elsewhere. The fighting in Burma's jungles rarely made front-page news. But strategic, Burma mattered enormously. This British colony served as the buffer between Japanese-occupied territory and India, the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. Burma also contained the Burma Road, a critical supply route into China. If Japan could hold Burma and cut China off completely, Chiang Kai-shek's forces might collapse, freeing up hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops for deployment elsewhere. In early 1942, Japan launched its invasion of Burma. The campaign was a disaster for the Allies. British, Indian, and Chinese forces found themselves outmaneuvered, outfought, and comprehensively defeated by Japanese troops, who seemed to move through the jungle like ghosts. The Japanese army excelled at jungle warfare. They were experts at infiltration, encirclement, and living off minimal supplies. They moved quickly through terrain that slowed Allied forces to a crawl. They appeared where they shouldn't be, struck when least expected, and melted away before counterattacks could materialize. By May 1942, Allied forces had completed a 1,000-mile retreat from Rangoon to India, the longest withdrawal in British military history. The Japanese had conquered Burma in less than 4 months. British and Indian troops arrived in India exhausted, demoralized, and suffering from disease. Many officers and men had become convinced that Japanese soldiers were simply better jungle fighters, perhaps even invincible in that environment. This belief in Japanese superiority in the jungle was perhaps the most dangerous casualty of the Burma campaign. Soldiers who believe the enemy is unbeatable rarely fight well. The British Army in India desperately needed something to restore confidence and prove that British and Indian troops could not only survive in the jungle, but could take the fight to the Japanese on their own terms. Major General Orde Wingate was many things: brilliant, eccentric, abrasive, visionary, difficult, and utterly convinced of his own rightness. Born in India in 1903 to a devoutly Christian family, Wingate grew up steeped in biblical imagery and Old Testament language. These influences would mark his entire career. He would quote scripture in military briefings, name his operations after biblical passages, and see himself as an instrument of divine will. His men would remember him standing before them in his Wolseley helmet and bushy beard, speaking in the cadences of an Old Testament prophet. But Wingate was far more than an eccentric with biblical delusions. He was a genuinely innovative military thinker who understood guerrilla warfare at a time when few British officers had given it serious thought. In Palestine during the late 1930s, Wingate organized the Special Night Squads, joint British-Jewish units that operated at night against Arab insurgents. His methods were unconventional, occasionally brutal, but effective. He proved that small, mobile units conducting surprise raids could achieve results far beyond their size. In 1940 and 41, Wingate commanded Gideon Force in Ethiopia. With fewer than 2,000 men, mostly Ethiopian irregulars and British officers, Wingate helped liberate Ethiopia from Italian occupation. Again, he demonstrated that guerrilla tactics, surprise, mobility, and aggressive leadership could defeat much larger conventional forces. General Archibald Wavell, who commanded British forces in the Middle East, took notice. Wavell saw in Wingate a man who might solve problems that conventional military thinking couldn't touch. Wingate's personal habits matched his unconventional military theories. He ate raw onions because he believed they were healthy, a habit that reportedly left him with breath so powerful it could clear a room. He scrubbed himself with a rubber brush instead of bathing properly. He would greet visitors to his tent while completely naked, apparently unconcerned with military decorum or social conventions. He wrote scathing reports that criticized superior officers and fellow commanders with brutal honesty, making himself deeply unpopular with much of the military establishment. He suffered from depression and at one point attempted suicide during his time in Egypt. But he was also phenomenally brave, driving himself harder than anyone else and leading from the front. His men might find him difficult, might be bewildered by his eccentricities, but they respected his courage and his willingness to share their hardships. When Wingate ordered a 200-mile march in 4 days, carrying full equipment, he marched alongside his troops. When he sent columns into the jungle behind enemy lines, he went with them. In March 1942, with Burma falling to the Japanese, Wavell, now commander-in-chief in India, sent for Wingate. Wavell wanted someone who could develop new tactics for jungle warfare, someone who could take the fight to the Japanese in ways that conventional forces couldn't. Wingate spent 2 months touring Burma as it fell, observing Japanese tactics, studying the terrain, and developing his theories. What Wingate proposed was radical. Long-range penetration groups. These would be brigade-sized forces that would march deep into enemy territory, hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines. They would operate for months at a time, entirely supplied by airdrops. They would be organized in small columns of roughly 340 men each, large enough to defend themselves and strike hard targets, small enough to move secretly through the jungle. They would attack Japanese communication lines, blow up railways and bridges, ambush convoys, and generally cause havoc in the enemy's rear areas. The concept challenged everything about conventional military wisdom. Armies needed supply lines, they needed bases, they needed to maintain communication with higher command. They couldn't just wander around hundreds of miles from friendly territory, supplied only by what fell from the sky. It was madness. Or was it visionary? Wavell, to his credit, was willing to find out. In July 1942, he authorized the formation of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, specifically for long-range penetration operations. Wingate would command it, train it, and prove his theories in actual combat. The Chindits were about to be born. The name Chindit itself came from the Burmese word Chinthe, the mythical lion-like creatures that guard Buddhist temples throughout Burma. Wingate, attempting to pronounce the Burmese word, came up with Chindit, and the name stuck. These fierce lions would become the unit's symbol, appearing on their badges and representing their mission to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The 77th Indian Infantry Brigade was a mixed force that reflected the diverse nature of Britain's military in Asia. About half the men were British, primarily from the 13th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment. The other half consisted of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, and the 2nd Battalion Burma Rifles. Later formations would include West African troops, bringing together one of the most diverse fighting forces of the war. Wingate's training program was characteristically intense and unorthodox. He established training camps in central India and put his men through conditions that approximated what they'd face in Burma. During the monsoon season, he had them living in the jungle, becoming accustomed to constant wet clothing, jungle diseases, and the claustrophobic feeling of being surrounded by dense vegetation. But Wingate didn't just train soldiers. He trained column commanders with particular care. He supervised them personally, using detailed sand table exercises to walk through every conceivable scenario. These weren't miniature figurines on a table. Wingate constructed 400-yard sandpits with landscapes dug to scale. His column commanders would crawl through these elaborate models, learning to visualize terrain, plan ambushes, and coordinate movements. The column organization itself was carefully designed. Each column of about 340 men was self-sufficient. They had their own mortars, machine guns, radio operators, medical staff, and reconnaissance sections. They traveled with about 120 mules to carry heavy equipment, mules being far better suited to jungle terrain than vehicles. A few ponies came along specifically for carrying wounded men. Each column could operate independently for weeks, or multiple columns could combine for larger operations before dispersing back into the jungle. Communication was critical. Each column had wireless operators with RAF radio sets capable of reaching back to India from hundreds of miles inside Burma, a range of 500 to 800 miles. These radios, standard equipment on Blenheim bombers, became the lifeline connecting the Chindits to their air support. Local communication between platoons relied on the FS6 radio set, though the short-range Type 21 sets proved almost useless. In the jungle, air supply represented the most revolutionary aspect of Chindit operations. No major military force had ever attempted to operate for months, supplied entirely from the air. Wingate worked closely with RAF Squadron 31, commanded by Wing Commander William Burberry, to develop procedures for supply drops. Aircraft would circle a pre-designated drop zone, watching for recognition signals from the ground. Then they'd release parachute-loaded containers of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment. Sometimes they'd even drop live mules, heavily sedated for the journey and parachuted in to replace pack animals lost to disease or enemy action. Every Chindit learned to recognize the Thor signals used for aerial recognition. They practiced laying out ground markers that pilots could spot from the air. They learned to calculate what supplies they'd need and how to request specific items. Drop zones had to be carefully selected, clearings large enough for supplies to land without getting caught in trees, but small enough and remote enough that the Japanese wouldn't easily spot them. The physical preparation was grueling. Wingate's men marched and marched and marched. They learned to live on minimal rations while carrying heavy loads. They practiced river crossings, demolitions, night movements, and ambush techniques. They trained in how to move silently through the jungle, how to camouflage themselves, how to navigate by compass when the jungle canopy blocked out the sun. Wingate also implemented a controversial policy regarding wounded men. He issued orders that seriously wounded Chindits who couldn't keep up with the column would have to be left behind. This brutal pragmatism reflected the reality of operating hundreds of miles from any medical facility. A man who couldn't march was a man who couldn't be saved. Wingate's officers often chose to ignore these orders when possible, but the policy highlighted the terrible choices that deep penetration operations would force upon leaders. By the end of 1942, the 77th Brigade was as ready as training could make them. The men had been tested physically and mentally. They understood their mission. They'd bonded as units during the hardships of training, but no amount of training could truly prepare them for what was coming. Because in February 1943, they were going into Burma for real. The original plan called for the Chindits to be part of a larger offensive into Burma. But that offensive was cancelled, leaving Wingate's brigade without the support it was supposed to have. Conventional military wisdom suggested cancelling the Chindit operation as well. What was the point of sending 3,000 men deep behind enemy lines if they weren't supporting a broader push? Wingate disagreed. He argued passionately that the operation should proceed anyway. Yes, it would be experimental. Yes, it would be risky. But it would prove the concept of long-range penetration. It would gather vital intelligence about operating in the Burmese jungle. It would test air supply procedures. And critically, it would boost morale by showing British and Indian troops that they could take the fight to the Japanese in the jungle. Wavell agreed. Operation Longcloth was authorized to proceed. On February 8, 1943, 3,000 Chindits, organized into 8 columns, began their march from Imphal toward the Chindwin River. Wingate himself accompanied the force, sharing the hardships of his men. In addresses to his troops, he mixed military briefing with biblical rhetoric. Today we stand on the threshold of battle. The time for preparation is over, and we are moving on the enemy to prove ourselves and our methods. We have all had the opportunity of withdrawing, and we are here because we have chosen to be here. We have chosen to bear the burden and heat of the day. On February 13th, the Chindits crossed the Chindwin River into Japanese-occupied Burma. The river crossing itself was an ordeal. Men waded chest-deep in dark water, fighting the current while clinging to guide ropes that had been towed across. Some couldn't swim and had to be ferried across on rafts along with the mules and heavy equipment. The Japanese apparently hadn't expected such an incursion. The crossing went unopposed. 2 days later, the Chindits encountered their first Japanese troops. The columns split according to plan. 2 columns marched south as a diversionary force, even employing a British officer impersonating a general to suggest that a major attack was coming from that direction. The RAF supported this deception with aerial attacks on southern targets. Meanwhile, 5 columns pushed eastward toward the main north-south railway line that supplied Japanese forces in northern Burma. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Calvert commanded one of these eastward-moving columns. Mad Mike Calvert was a Royal Engineer officer who'd become one of Wingate's most trusted lieutenants. Aggressive, brave to the point of recklessness, and utterly devoted to the mission, Calvert led his column to the railway valley. On March 4th, they reached their target and spent hours laying demolition charges. That night, explosions tore apart 70 sections of the railway line. 2 days later, Brigadier Bernard Ferguson's column arrived at the railway and repeated Calvert's success. These sabotage operations represented exactly what Wingate had envisioned. Small, mobile forces appearing deep behind enemy lines, striking hard at vulnerable infrastructure, then vanishing back into the jungle before the Japanese could respond in strength. But the railway damage proved only temporary. The Japanese repaired the broken sections within a few days, and now they knew a significant British force was operating in their rear areas. Japanese patrols began hunting the Chindits. The columns pushed further east, crossing the Irrawaddy River, a major water barrier that Wingate hoped would give his force more operating space. But conditions on the far side of the Irrawaddy proved far worse than intelligence had suggested. The area was dry teak jungle, forests with towering trees but little undergrowth and, critically, very little water. In a climate where a man could easily need 12 pints of water per day, finding adequate water sources became a desperate challenge. The Japanese also had better road networks on that side of the river than expected. While the Chindits struggled through trackless jungle, Japanese forces used the roads to move quickly and positioned forces to intercept the British columns. The combination of better Japanese mobility and scarcity of water began to force the Chindits into an increasingly smaller area, a box where the Japanese could concentrate their forces. Wingate also began changing his plans repeatedly, sometimes without informing all his column commanders. This led to confusion, with different columns receiving different instructions. 2 columns were ambushed by the Japanese in separate actions and suffered heavy casualties. These survivors eventually made their way back to India, but as combat-effective units, they'd been destroyed. On March 24, Eastern Army Headquarters ordered Wingate to withdraw. The Chindits had reached the range limits of their air supply. Planes were having to fly so far that they couldn't carry full loads. Fighter escort for the supply aircraft was no longer possible. The Japanese were closing in. It was time to get out. But how? The Chindits were scattered across a vast area of jungle, hundreds of miles from India. The Japanese now knew roughly where they were and were actively hunting them. The monsoon season was approaching, which would make movement even more difficult. Wingate made a command decision that remains controversial. He ordered the columns to abandon their mules and heavy equipment, break into small dispersal groups of about 40 men each, and make their way back to India independently. The reasoning was sound. Smaller groups would be harder for the Japanese to locate and could move more stealthily through the jungle. But it also meant scattering his force with only sketchy plans for reassembly. What followed was an epic of endurance. Small groups of exhausted, hungry men struggled through the jungle toward the Chindwin River and safety beyond. They moved mostly at night to avoid Japanese patrols. They lived on whatever supplies they had left and whatever they could find or trade for in local villages. Some groups became lost in the maze-like jungle. Others ran into Japanese patrols and had to fight or evade. Disease hit hard. Malaria struck men down with fevers that left them barely able to walk. Dysentery caused debilitating diarrhea and cramping. Jungle sores, cuts and scrapes that became infected in the humid conditions spread across men's bodies. Some Chindits lost 30 or 40 pounds during the operation. They became walking skeletons, bearded, filthy, and pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. The wounded presented heart-wrenching choices. Men who couldn't keep up had to be left behind. Some were left in villages with the hope that locals would care for them. Some were hidden in jungle clearings with whatever supplies could be spared. These men faced an uncertain fate, possible rescue, possible capture, or a lonely death from wounds and disease. Those orders Wingate had given about leaving the wounded behind, which many officers had privately hoped never to implement, now became terrible reality. Some Chindits managed to cross into China instead of returning to India. A few were captured by the Japanese. Many simply disappeared, their final fates unknown. The first Chindit survivors began straggling back into India in April. They continued arriving through May and June. Of the 3,000 men who'd marched into Burma in February, 2,182 eventually returned. But only about 600 of those were judged fit for further active service. The remainder were so broken by disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion that they needed extended hospitalization and recovery time. Many never fully recovered their health. The casualty numbers told a stark story. 818 Chindits had been killed, captured, or died of disease during Operation Longcloth. Another 1,600 were physically unfit for combat. That's a casualty rate approaching 90% when you count men rendered non-effective by illness. For an operation that achieved only temporary damage to one railway line, the cost seemed astronomically high. So was Operation Longcloth a failure? The answer depends entirely on what you measure. Military historians remain divided about Operation Longcloth's value. General William Slim, who commanded the 14th Army in Burma and was generally an admirer of the Chindits' courage, was blunt in his assessment. He later wrote that Longcloth gave little tangible return for the losses it had suffered and the resources it had absorbed. The damage it did to Japanese communications was repaired in a few days, and it had no immediate effect on Japanese dispositions or plans. The Japanese themselves seemed to agree. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed that they considered the Chindit incursion to have caused little trouble. Yes, the railway was temporarily cut. Yes, some supplies were lost. But the Japanese quickly repaired the damage and never felt their operations were seriously threatened by the British force wandering around in their rear areas. Wingate, unsurprisingly, took a very different view. In his after-action report, he argued that Operation Longcloth had completely validated the concept of long-range penetration. British and Indian troops had operated hundreds of miles behind enemy lines for nearly 3 months. Supplied entirely by air, they'd proven that jungle warfare wasn't some mystical art that only the Japanese could master. They demonstrated that air supply could sustain significant forces in even the most remote terrain. And perhaps most importantly, Longcloth had a massive psychological impact. Back in Britain, the operation was touted as a major success. After years of defeats and withdrawals in the Far East, here finally was a story of British troops taking the fight to the Japanese. The press ate it up. Wingate became a celebrity, the bearded prophet who led his men into the jungle and came back having bloodied the enemy's nose. For troops in India who'd been demoralized by the 1942 defeats, the Chindits proved that Japanese soldiers weren't invincible jungle fighters. If Wingate's men could survive and operate behind enemy lines, then perhaps British and Indian forces more generally could match the Japanese in jungle combat. The morale boost was real and significant. The operation also had an unexpected effect on Japanese strategy. The ease with which British forces had penetrated deep into Burma disturbed Japanese commanders. If the British could do this with one brigade, what might they attempt with larger forces? The Japanese High Command concluded that their defensive posture in Burma was no longer viable. They needed to take offensive action. This thinking contributed directly to the Japanese decision to launch Operation Yugo in 1944. Their invasion of India aimed at capturing Imphal and Kohima. That offensive would prove to be a catastrophic failure for the Japanese, leading to their worst defeat of the war in Burma and opening the door for eventual Allied victory in the theatre. So Operation Longcloth, which appeared to have minimal direct military impact, may have indirectly influenced Japanese strategy in ways that ultimately worked to the Allies' advantage. Proving such connections is difficult, but the historical evidence suggests the Chindits caused more concern in Tokyo than the immediate damage to one railway line would seem to warrant. From a tactical perspective, Longcloth provided invaluable lessons. The RAF learned how to conduct supply drops more effectively. Column commanders learned which tactics worked and which didn't. The importance of mules, the challenges of jungle navigation, the difficulties of maintaining radio communications through dense jungle canopy, the medical requirements for troops operating in such conditions, all of these lessons would prove vital for future operations. Wingate himself took away critical insights. He realized that columns needed to be able to concentrate more quickly when faced with Japanese resistance. He understood that having only 1 or 2 exit routes back to India was dangerous. Future operations would need multiple extraction options. He recognized that the stronghold concept, fortified bases behind enemy lines from which columns could operate, might address some of the vulnerabilities his dispersed columns had faced. And perhaps most importantly, the operation caught the attention of Winston Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff. When Wingate was summoned to the Quebec Conference in August 1943, Churchill was fascinated by this unconventional officer who'd led his men hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. Wingate briefed the assembled Allied leadership with his characteristic blend of strategic thinking and prophetic fervor. The result exceeded even Wingate's hopes. The combined chiefs authorized a massive expansion of the Chindit force. Instead of one brigade conducting experimental operations, Wingate would get 6 brigades, roughly 20,000 men, and the Americans, impressed by the concept of long-range penetration warfare, agreed to provide dedicated air support in the form of the 1st Air Commando. Operation Thursday was approved. The Chindits would return to Burma, but this time on a scale that would make Operation Longcloth look like a small-scale raid. The question was whether the lessons learned and the expanded resources would overcome the fundamental challenges that had made Longcloth so costly. The men who'd survived the first expedition had endured hell. Many still bore the physical and psychological scars of those months in the jungle, and they were about to do it all over again on a scale never before attempted. Before we follow the Chindits back into Burma for Operation Thursday, we need to understand exactly what daily life was like for these men in the jungle. Modern readers, comfortable and safe, can perhaps intellectually grasp that jungle warfare was difficult. But the reality went far beyond mere difficulty into a realm of sustained suffering that tested human limits. Start with the weight. Every Chindit carried between 72 and 80 pounds of equipment on his back. For a Bren gunner, that weight could reach 80 pounds. Remember, these weren't exceptionally large men. Average British and Indian soldiers of the period might weigh 140 to 160 pounds. They were literally carrying half their body weight. The packs contained their entire world: ammunition, grenades, rations, water purification tablets, medical kit, ground sheet, extra clothing, entrenching tool, personal items. Add a rifle and you're hauling what feels like 2 fully loaded suitcases through terrain that would challenge an unencumbered hiker. Now do it for weeks at a time, often with inadequate food, while sick with multiple tropical diseases. The jungle itself was a living adversary. In most areas, the canopy overhead created a perpetual twilight even during daylight hours. Visibility dropped to 30 feet or less. Men marching in column often couldn't see the soldier 2 positions ahead of them. This claustrophobic environment played havoc with nerves. You never knew what was waiting around the next bend. Behind the next tree, where there wasn't established trail, the jungle was nearly impassable without clearing it. Chindits sometimes spent hours hacking paths through dense vegetation with machetes and kukris. One column even commandeered an elephant to help clear a particularly difficult section. Progress could slow to 100 yards per hour in the worst terrain. The temperature and humidity were punishing. Northern Burma's jungles regularly saw temperatures of 110 to 112 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 100%. Sweat poured constantly. Clothing never dried. In fact, clothing and webbing rotted from the constant moisture, requiring repeated patching and repair. A man operating in those conditions needed roughly 12 pints of water per day just to stay hydrated, but water wasn't always available. The dry teak jungle that had caught Wingate's force by surprise during Longcloth contained almost no standing water despite the oppressive humidity. Men would march for hours, sometimes days, desperately thirsty, before finding a stream or water source. When they did find water, it had to be treated. Every Chindit carried water purification tablets, but supplies were limited. When tablets ran out, they'd boil water over small, smokeless fires, smokeless because smoke would reveal their position to Japanese patrols. Drinking untreated water was a desperate last resort that almost guaranteed dysentery or worse. The rations were inadequate for the caloric demands of jungle operations. Chindits subsisted primarily on American K rations, supposedly 3 meal packs per day, providing 2,900 calories total. But airdrops were frequently unsuccessful, with supplies missing the drop zone entirely or being damaged on landing. 5 days' worth of rations often had to stretch for 8 days or longer, and even when they got their full rations, 2,900 calories wasn't nearly enough for men carrying heavy loads through difficult terrain in extreme heat. Rifleman Jack Redding of the King's Own Royal Regiment lost 3 stone, 42 pounds, in just 18 weeks behind enemy lines. Many Chindits lost a third of their body weight during operations. They became walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging loose, their faces gaunt. But it was the diseases that truly broke men. Malaria was endemic in Burma's jungles. The Anopheles mosquito carrying the malaria parasite thrived in the warm, wet conditions. Despite taking anti-malarial drugs when available, Chindits fell ill by the hundreds. Malarial attacks began with chills so violent that men's teeth chattered uncontrollably despite the heat. Then came fever, temperatures soaring to 104, 105 degrees. Men became delirious, barely able to walk, yet they had to keep marching because falling behind meant being left behind. The deadliest form was cerebral malaria, which attacked the brain and killed quickly. Scrub typhus, transmitted by mites found in jungle undergrowth, caused similar symptoms and was equally deadly. Men lived in constant fear of these diseases, knowing that each insect bite might be the one that laid them low. Dysentery attacked the digestive system with brutal efficiency. Amoebic dysentery caused severe cramping, bloody diarrhea, and rapid dehydration. Men would lose dangerous amounts of fluid while needing to keep marching. The disease weakened them dramatically, making them more susceptible to other infections. Soldiers with dysentery often couldn't eat what little food they had because their digestive systems couldn't process it. Jungle sores might sound relatively minor compared to malaria or dysentery, but they were a constant torment. Any cut, scratch, or abrasion in the humid jungle environment became infected almost immediately. The infection spread, creating ulcerated sores that refused to heal. Some men developed dozens of these sores across their bodies. The sores became septic, poisoning the blood. Without proper medical treatment, even minor wounds could become life-threatening infections. Trench foot, more accurately called jungle rot in this context, affected men's feet constantly subjected to wet conditions. The skin would soften, peel, and develop painful lesions. Walking became agony, but walking was what Chindits did every single day. The wildlife added another layer of misery. Burma's jungles hosted over 100 species of snakes, including deadly kraits and cobras. Soldiers learned to shake out their boots before putting them on and to examine their sleeping areas carefully before lying down. Leeches were everywhere, thick as a man's thumb. They'd attach to any exposed skin and gorge on blood. Chindits would finish a day's march and find a dozen or more leeches attached to their legs, necks, and arms. Removing them was a nightly ritual. Insects swarmed constantly. Mosquitoes, flies, gnats, they bit, stung, and generally made life miserable. The buzzing never stopped. Men scratched at bites until they bled, creating more potential sites for infection. The psychological toll matched the physical. Chindits lived with constant fear of ambush. They never knew when they might bump a Japanese patrol or when the enemy might be lying in wait around the next bend in the trail. Most ambushes happen by accident. Two forces moving through the jungle suddenly encountering each other at close range, leading to confused firefights where it was hard to distinguish friend from enemy in the dim green light. The isolation was profound. You're hundreds of miles from friendly territory, days or weeks from help. If something goes wrong, if you're badly wounded, if you develop serious illness, if your column gets cut off, there's no easy extraction. You can't call for a helicopter medevac. You can't expect reinforcements. You're on your own in a hostile environment, surrounded by enemies. Sleep was fitful at best. Chindits couldn't build proper camps or establish secure perimeters. They'd bivouac in the jungle, setting minimal security while trying to rest. But the jungle never truly quieted. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness. Was that rustling a wild animal or a Japanese patrol? That snapping branch, natural settling or someone approaching? Men would wake from exhausted sleep at every unusual sound, adrenaline pumping, weapon ready. The combination of all these factors, the weight, the climate, the diseases, the fear, the isolation, the inadequate food, created what came to be called Chindit Syndrome. This wasn't a single condition, but rather a constellation of symptoms. Chronic malaria, persistent dysentery, infected jungle sores, extreme malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Men with Chindit syndrome often had 2 or 3 of these conditions simultaneously, any one of which would normally require hospitalization. Doctors' reports from later in the war described Chindit syndrome in clinical detail. Patients with barely detectable pulses, extreme dehydration, multiple parasitic infections, severe vitamin deficiencies, and often psychological trauma manifesting as nightmares, jumpiness, and difficulty readjusting to normal conditions. Recovery could take months or years. Some men never fully recovered. Yet through all of this, the Chindits kept operating. They marched, they fought, they conducted raids on Japanese positions. They maintained unit cohesion, even when reduced to a fraction of their original strength. The question of how they endured such conditions has no easy answer. Part of it was leadership, officers like Calvert and Ferguson, who shared their men's hardships. Part of it was unit pride and the bonds formed through shared suffering. Part of it was simply the knowledge that giving up meant dying in the jungle, so you kept putting one foot in front of the other. Many Chindits later said that nothing in their subsequent lives was ever as difficult as those months in Burma. Whatever happened to them afterward, career setbacks, personal tragedies, health problems, they knew they'd already survived the worst that life could throw at them. That resilience, that absolute knowledge of their own toughness, became perhaps the only positive legacy of the horrific conditions they'd endured. And these were the conditions the Chindits would face again during Operation Thursday. But this time, they'd be there in far greater numbers for a longer period and with even higher stakes. The planning for Operation Thursday dwarfed anything attempted during Operation Longcloth. Wingate now commanded not 1 brigade but 6, the 77th and 111th Indian Infantry Brigades, the latter commanded by Joe Lentane, plus the 14th, 16th and 23rd British Infantry Brigades formed from the 70th Division and the 3rd West African Brigade. Together these units totaled, roughly, 20,000 men, more than 6 times the force that had entered Burma in 1943. The expansion required breaking up experienced divisions, which angered many conventional commanders who felt that well-trained line divisions were being wasted on Wingate's experiments. But Wingate had Churchill's backing, and after Quebec, resources flowed to the Chindits. Most revolutionary was the air support. The Americans provided the 1st Air Commando, commanded by Lieutenant Colonels Philip Cochrane and John Allison. This wasn't just transport aircraft, it was an entire air force dedicated to Chindit operations. The unit included 30 P-51 Mustang fighters for air superiority and ground attack, 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers configured as gunships, 100 light aircraft for casualty evacuation, 12 UC-64 utility aircraft, a fleet of C-47 transports, and 100 Waco gliders. The gliders were key to Wingate's new strategy. Unlike Operation Longcloth's overland march, most of the Chindit force would fly into Burma aboard gliders towed by the C-47s. The gliders would land in jungle clearings, and the troops would immediately begin constructing fortified positions and airstrips. Wingate called these positions strongholds. The stronghold concept represented a major evolution in Wingate's thinking. Instead of having columns constantly on the move and vulnerable to Japanese pressure, the Chindits would establish heavily defended bases deep behind enemy lines. These strongholds would have airstrips for supply and casualty evacuation, artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and strong perimeter defenses. Columns would operate from these bases, conducting raids and ambushes, then return to the safety of the stronghold. Floater columns would patrol outside the stronghold perimeter, ready to counterattack Japanese forces attempting to assault the base. The stronghold would become both a defensive fortress and an offensive springboard, a revolutionary concept that blended traditional fixed defense with guerrilla operations. 3 jungle clearings were selected as landing zones for the initial glider assault. They received code names drawn from famous streets: Piccadilly, named after the street in London, Broadway from New York, and Chowringhee from Calcutta. Intelligence photos showed these clearings to be suitable for glider landings and defensible once troops were on the ground. Training for Operation Thursday consumed the final months of 1943. The men practiced glider landings, learned to work with American air crews, and rehearsed the stronghold construction procedures. Mules were trained to ride in gliders, a process that required heavy sedation of the animals and special loading procedures. Engineers practiced the rapid construction of airstrips from jungle clearings, using minimal equipment. Everything had to be timed precisely. The first glider wave would carry engineers and security troops who'd land in darkness, secure the landing zone, and begin clearing obstacles for additional gliders and powered aircraft. The second wave would bring more troops, mules, and heavy equipment, including bulldozers. Within 36 hours, Wingate expected to have functional strongholds with operable airstrips, ready to receive C-47 transport aircraft, bringing in the main force. The 16th Brigade under Bernard Ferguson would march in overland, taking a 600-mile trek through some of the worst terrain on Earth. This march would serve multiple purposes. It would draw Japanese attention away from the air landing zones. It would establish blocking positions along Japanese supply routes. And it would prove that even with air operations available, overland infiltration remained viable. As the launch date approached in early March 1944, tension ran high. This was the largest airborne operation yet attempted in the Pacific Theater, larger than anything being planned for Europe at that point. If it succeeded, it would validate everything Wingate had been preaching about long-range penetration. If it failed, thousands of men would be stranded behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue. On March 5, 1944, the operation was hours away from launch. Gliders were lined up at Lalagat airfield in Assam, their tow ropes attached to C-47 transports. Troops checked weapons and equipment one final time. Mules stood sedated, waiting to be loaded. Pilots reviewed flight plans. The target was Broadway, 150 miles behind Japanese lines. Then came the reconnaissance photos. An aerial reconnaissance flight had been sent to photograph the landing zones one final time, just to confirm nothing had changed. When the photos came back and were developed, they showed something that made everyone's blood run cold. Piccadilly was covered with logs. Massive teak tree trunks lay scattered across the clearing, making it completely unusable as a landing zone. The sight of those logs sent shock waves through the command group gathered at Lalagat. Wingate's immediate reaction was that the operation had been betrayed. The Japanese knew they were coming and had deliberately blocked the landing zone. If Piccadilly was blocked, surely Broadway and Chowringhee would be trapped too. To launch the operation now would be sending thousands of men to certain death or capture. He used the word murder to describe what would happen if they proceeded as planned. Colonel Philip Cochrane of the 1st Air Commando disagreed. He'd ordered the reconnaissance flight on his own initiative, and now he studied the photos carefully.
Cochrane pointed out that if the Japanese knew about the operation and wanted to ambush the Chindits, they'd have covered all 3 landing zones with logs, but only Piccadilly was blocked. Broadway and Chowringhee appeared clear. This suggested the logs at Piccadilly resulted from something else, possibly routine logging.
Operations. The debate grew heated. Minutes ticked by. Gliders sat ready on the runway. Troops waited for the order to board. The entire operation hung in the balance. General Slim, who'd come to Lalagat to observe the launch, made the decision. He took full responsibility and ordered the operation to proceed using Broadway and Chowringhee instead of Piccadilly. 77th Brigade, originally slated for Piccadilly, would fly into Broadway. Yes, it meant cramming more aircraft and troops into a single landing zone than planned. Yes, it increased the risks, but the alternative was scrubbing the entire operation and admitting defeat before a single shot was fired. Wingate accepted the decision, though his face showed the strain. Calvert, who'd been standing by waiting for orders, reportedly said he'd been ready to go even if the Japanese were waiting with tanks. At 6:12 in the evening, the first wave of gliders took off. Due to the change of plans and the urgency to get as many troops into Broadway as quickly as possible, the decision was made to have each C-47 tow 2 gliders instead of the standard single tow. The heavily laden transports strained to gain altitude, their engines laboring under the extra load. Some overheated, some tow ropes snapped. Gliders broke free and crashed in the jungle, killing everyone aboard. But many made it. The sky over Assam filled with the roar of engines and the whisper of gliders. They flew east toward Burma, crossing the mountains that separate India from the Burmese lowlands. The peaks below them reached 7,000 feet. If a tow rope broke here, the glider and its occupants would plunge into terrain where rescue was impossible. The flight took several hours. Gliders flew through bright moonlight. Visibility was good, which helped pilots but also meant Japanese observers might spot them. The formation flew over Japanese-occupied territory, knowing that enemy anti-aircraft gunners could open up at any moment. But the Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Intelligence had detected no unusual Allied activity. They had no idea a major airborne assault was incoming. Around 2:30 in the morning of March 6th, the first gliders approached Broadway. Down below, the clearing looked tiny from the air, barely large enough for the planned landings. The gliders released from their tow ropes and began their descent in the darkness. The initial landings were a disaster. The aerial photographs had failed to show 2 trees in the landing zone and several deep ditches crossing the clearing. The first gliders slammed into these obstacles at high speed. Some broke apart on impact. Others flipped and tumbled. Men were thrown from their seats, crushed by shifting cargo, or trapped in wreckage. Mules screamed in terror and pain. More gliders kept coming in, their pilots unable to see the wrecks ahead in the darkness. They landed on top of crashed gliders or swerved to avoid them and hit trees. The clearing filled with wrecked gliders and injured men. An American bulldozer had made it through intact, which was fortunate. It proved essential for clearing the landing zone. Despite the chaos, discipline held. Officers rallied their men. Medics moved among the wounded. Engineers began clearing debris. Security teams fanned out to establish a defensive perimeter, expecting Japanese troops to arrive at any moment. The bulldozer roared to life and began pushing wrecked gliders aside and filling in the ditches that had caused so much damage. Back at Lalagat, the command team waited in agonized suspense. Radio reports came in fragmentary and confusing. Multiple crashes confirmed, casualties unknown, landing zone compromised. The decision was made to halt further glider launches until the situation clarified. Then, at 6:30 in the morning, came the signal everyone had been waiting for. Sawyer Link, the code word meaning Broadway was secure and operational. Despite everything, Calvert's men had seized and held the landing zone. The stronghold was being established. C-47 transport aircraft began landing at Broadway almost immediately. They brought in more troops, supplies, and most critically, engineers with equipment to construct a proper airstrip. By the evening of March 6th, despite the disastrous initial landings, Broadway was functioning as planned. Troops were digging defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns were being assembled. The airstrip was being graded and extended. Meanwhile, 12 gliders had flown to the second landing zone, Chowring-He. Those landings went far more smoothly, no hidden obstacles awaited. By March 8th, both Broadway and Chowring-He were fully operational, with over 1,200 men, 200 mules, and vast amounts of equipment flown in. Then the decision was made to abandon Chowring-He. It proved more vulnerable to Japanese air attack than expected, and concentrating forces made more sense than spreading them across multiple bases. Hours after the last troops evacuated Chowring-He, Japanese bombers attacked it. They found an empty clearing. On March 13th, the Japanese discovered Broadway and launched an air attack with about 40 aircraft. But Wingate had anticipated this. 6 Spitfires had been flown into Broadway, along with a mobile radar unit. When the Japanese bombers appeared, the Spitfires scrambled and tore into them. 4 Japanese aircraft were shot down for the loss of 1 Spitfire. A subsequent attack a few days later met similar results. The Japanese, unable to knock out Broadway from the air and wary of approaching it on the ground given the Chindits' strength, chose to monitor it rather than assault it directly. This gave the Chindits time to fully establish their positions. Broadway became a functioning airbase and fortress deep in enemy territory. Troops built bunkers and dugouts, engineers laid barbed wire and minefields. Artillery pieces were positioned to provide covering fire. A network of interlocking defenses made the stronghold extremely difficult to assault. From Broadway, Chindit columns fanned out to conduct raids. Calvert took columns west to Railway Valley, where the main rail line ran north, supplying Japanese forces facing General Stilwell's Chinese troops. On March 16th, Calvert established a third stronghold called White City at Henu, near Maulu. The name came from the white parachutes left hanging in trees after supply drops, creating a bizarre landscape of ghostly fabric in the jungle. White City's position was deliberately provocative. It sat astride the main north-south railway and road, blocking the Japanese supply line to their northern divisions. The Japanese couldn't ignore it. They had to attack White City, or their forces in the north would wither from lack of supplies. But taking White City wouldn't be easy. Before establishing the stronghold, Calvert had to clear Japanese forces from nearby Pagoda Hill. The fighting there was brutal, close-quarters combat in which Lieutenant George Cairns earned the Victoria Cross through an act of almost suicidal bravery. During hand-to-hand fighting, a Japanese officer wielding a katana severed Cairns' left arm completely. Rather than falling, Cairns picked up a bayoneted rifle with his remaining arm, killed his attacker, grabbed the katana, and continued fighting. He led a charge that helped secure the position before dying of blood loss and shock. His example inspired the men around him to fight with desperate ferocity, and Pagoda Hill fell to the Chindits. With White City established, Calvert's brigade had created a killing zone. Japanese supply convoys trying to use the road and railway ran straight into Chindit ambushes. Trains were derailed. Trucks were destroyed. Japanese garrison troops in the area found themselves under constant attack. The stronghold became exactly what Wingate had envisioned, a fortified base from which mobile columns could strike repeatedly. A fourth stronghold, Aberdeen, was established to support operations around Indore, a major Japanese base. Bernard Ferguson's 16th Brigade, having completed their grueling overland march, operated in the area, though their attempt to actually take Indore was repulsed by stronger than expected Japanese forces. By the end of March 1944, Operation Thursday appeared to be succeeding brilliantly. 4 strongholds had been established. Chindit columns were wreaking havoc on Japanese communications. The air supply operation was functioning well. The 1st Air Commando's light aircraft were evacuating wounded men who might otherwise have died in the jungle. Over 1,000 casualties were flown out in the first month alone. Churchill sent Wingate a congratulatory telegram praising the outstanding success of Operation Thursday. The Prime Minister's support seemed vindicated. Wingate's theories about long-range penetration, strongholds and air supply had been proven on a scale that dwarfed Operation Longcloth. Then, on March 24th, everything changed. Major General Orde Wingate boarded a B-25 Mitchell bomber at Imphal for a return flight to his headquarters. He'd been visiting Chindit positions and coordinating with the 1st Air Commando. 2 London war correspondents asked to join the flight to get back to file their stories. The pilot protested that the plane was already overloaded, too many passengers, too much fuel for the return journey. But Wingate agreed to take the correspondence anyway. The Mitchell took off and headed northwest toward the border between Burma and India. Weather was deteriorating, with thunderstorms developing over the mountains. The plane flew into the storm and was never seen again. Search parties eventually found the wreckage in the jungle-covered mountains of northeastern India. All aboard had been killed instantly in the crash. Investigators believed the plane had flown into the thunderstorm, been overwhelmed by turbulence and wind shear, and slammed into a mountainside. Whether the overloading had contributed to the crash remained unclear, but the pilot's concerns had proven tragically prescient. Wingate was buried temporarily in Burma, then later reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, an honor rarely extended to foreign officers, but approved in recognition of the close cooperation between British and American forces in the Burma campaign. The impact of Wingate's death on the Chindit operation cannot be overstated. He'd been more than just a commander. He'd been the visionary who created the entire concept, the force of will that pushed the operation through skeptical military bureaucracy, the inspirational leader who could motivate exhausted men to keep going. His death created a leadership vacuum at the worst possible time, with thousands of troops already committed deep behind enemy lines. Slim had to choose a replacement quickly. After consultation with Brigadier Derek Tulloch, Wingate's chief of staff, Slim selected Joe Lentane to take command. On paper, Lentane made sense. He'd commanded a brigade successfully, had attended staff college, and was considered a balanced and experienced officer. But he was also fundamentally different from Wingate in temperament and philosophy. Where Wingate had been unconventional and aggressive, Lentane was methodical and conventional. Where Wingate had absolute faith in his long-range penetration theories, Lentane was more skeptical. Where Wingate had the personality and connections to push back against higher command when he disagreed with their plans, Lentane was more willing to accept orders even when he had doubts about them. The new command structure also promoted officers who shared Lentane's more conventional outlook. Wingate's natural successors, men like Calvert, who thoroughly understood and believed in long-range penetration doctrine, were passed over. Almost immediately, a philosophical divide opened within the Chindit command. Officers who'd been loyal to Wingate and his methods found themselves frustrated by the new leadership. Then came an even more consequential change. The Japanese launched their invasion of India, Operation Longcloth, with attacks on Imphal and Kohima. These battles became critical for the entire Burma campaign. If the Japanese could break through and capture the supply bases at Imphal, they'd threaten all of northeastern India and potentially force a British withdrawal. Slim needed every resource to hold at Imphal and Kohima. The 23rd Brigade, which hadn't yet flown into Burma, was redirected to Kohima to help with the defense there. Much of the air support that had been dedicated to the Chindits got diverted to supplying the besieged garrisons. And critically, operational control of the Chindit forces in Burma was transferred to American General Joseph Stilwell. Stilwell commanded the Northern Combat Area Command, essentially American and Chinese forces trying to advance south through northern Burma to eventually link up with the main British forces and reopen the Burma Road to China. He'd been impressed by the Chindits' ability to operate in the Japanese rear and wanted to use them to support his advance on Myitkyina and Mogaung, 2 key towns in northern Burma. But Stilwell had no real understanding of long-range penetration doctrine or the limitations of forces designed for guerrilla operations. To him, the Chindits were simply additional infantry brigades available for his use. He began issuing orders for the Chindits to conduct conventional operations, capture and hold specific positions, assault fortified towns, and generally function as standard line infantry. This was exactly what the Chindits weren't designed or equipped to do. They had no tanks, limited artillery, no heavy weapons beyond mortars. They'd been trained for hit-and-run raids, ambushes, and mobile operations. Now they were being ordered to conduct set-piece battles against dug-in Japanese positions without the supporting arms that normal infantry divisions relied on. Lentaigne objected, but ultimately complied with Stilwell's orders. Calvert and other brigade commanders argued strenuously against the change in mission, but were overruled. Wingate's concept of mobile strongholds and raiding columns was being abandoned in favor of using the Chindits as conventional troops in the wrong role. The decision was made to abandon Broadway and White City and move the Chindit brigades north to support Stilwell's operations. Calvert was appalled. White City had successfully blocked Japanese communications for months and could continue to do so. Stilwell himself was initially concerned that abandoning White City would allow Japanese reinforcements to move north freely, but Lentaigne insisted the brigades were too dispersed to support each other and that the airstrips would be unusable during the approaching monsoon, so the strongholds were given up and the Chindits marched north into a nightmare. 111th Brigade, now commanded by Jack Masters, Lentaigne, having moved up to overall command, was ordered to establish a new stronghold called Blackpool at Hopin, about 30 miles south of Mogaung. Unlike the previous strongholds, which had been carefully positioned in remote jungle away from Japanese concentrations, Blackpool was placed close to major Japanese positions and main supply routes. The brigade arrived at the Blackpool site on May 7th and immediately came under heavy Japanese attack. They barely had time to construct basic defenses before Japanese forces with artillery support launched coordinated assaults. Where White City had benefited from weeks to prepare elaborate defenses, Blackpool was under siege almost from the moment it was established. The Japanese brought up anti-aircraft guns and began shooting down supply planes. The monsoon had broken, turning the stronghold into a morass of mud and flooding the slit trenches where men tried to take cover. Supplies couldn't get through consistently. Wounded men couldn't be evacuated. The brigade was slowly being ground down by artillery fire and infantry assaults while living in flooded holes, subsisting on reduced rations and watching disease rates climb. After 20 days of continuous fighting, the airstrip was lost and the perimeter breached. Masters had no choice but to order a withdrawal. The seriously wounded who couldn't be moved faced a terrible choice: capture by the Japanese, who were notorious for their treatment of prisoners, or being mercifully shot by their own officers. Some wounded men chose the latter rather than face what the Japanese might do to them. The evacuation of Blackpool was a nightmare march through monsoon rains, carrying wounded on improvised stretchers, constantly harassed by Japanese patrols. Many men died during the withdrawal. The 111th Brigade, which had entered Burma as a strong, effective fighting force, was now shattered. Meanwhile, Calvert's 77th Brigade received orders to capture Mogaung. The town was a major Japanese stronghold with an estimated 4,000 defenders. The Japanese had fortified it extensively with concrete bunkers, prepared fighting positions, and overlapping fields of fire. Taking such a position would challenge even a full-strength division with armor and artillery support. Calvert had about 2,000 men. They had mortars, but no artillery. They had no tanks. What they did have was 1st Air Commando support. Mustang fighters could conduct strikes on Japanese positions, providing the only heavy firepower available. and they had their own desperate determination to finish the job and get out of Burma. The battle for Mogaung began on June 6th and immediately devolved into brutal close-quarters fighting. The Chindits fought house to house, bunker to bunker, the Yorsh. Monsoon had arrived in full force, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Men fought knee-deep in mud and water. Casualties mounted rapidly. The conditions were horrific even by Chindit standards. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus ravaged the brigade. Trench foot afflicted nearly everyone. Jungle sores covered men's bodies. Troops were literally falling apart from disease and malnutrition, even as they continued to fight. By June 13th, medical officers reported that only 550 men in the entire brigade were fit for combat. The rest were sick, wounded, or both. Calvert sent desperate messages to higher command describing the situation. He was told to keep fighting. Chinese forces of the 38th Division were supposedly on their way to help, but they were delayed. For days, the shattered remnants of 77th Brigade held on and continued attacking because Stilwell's orders were to take Mogaung at all costs. Captain Michael Almond of the 6th Gurkhas performed extraordinary acts of heroism during the fighting, personally destroying multiple Japanese machine gun positions. He was killed on June 23rd after being shot multiple times while charging an enemy bunker. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Rifleman Tul Bahadur Poon, also of the 6th Gurkhas, single-handedly assaulted a heavily defended house called the Red House, charging across open ground under intense fire. Despite being the only survivor of his section, he killed multiple Japanese soldiers and took the position. He survived and received the Victoria Cross in person. The Chinese finally arrived on June 18th, providing reinforcement. By June 27th, Mogaung fell. The Japanese had withdrawn from the ruins rather than be annihilated. Mogaung became the first major town in Burma liberated by Allied forces. But the cost to 77th Brigade was catastrophic. Out of approximately 2,000 men who began the battle, the brigade had suffered 800 battle casualties, a 50% casualty rate. Of the remaining 1,200, only about 300 were fit for further combat. Everyone else was sick, wounded, or physically broken by 4 months of sustained jungle operations. Calvert received orders to move his brigade to Mietkina to join the siege there. He looked at his men, skeletal figures, many barely able to walk, others carried on stretchers. Moving them to another battle was insane. It would kill them. So Calvert made a decision that could have resulted in his court-martial. He shut down his brigade's radios and marched out to Kamaing, where Stilwell had his headquarters. He was going to confront the American general face-to-face and force him to see what condition the Chindits were actually in. When Calvert arrived at Stilwell's headquarters, gaunt, exhausted, and accompanied by his equally devastated men, even the notoriously hard-nosed American general was shocked. Stilwell had been receiving reports about Chindit conditions, but seeing the reality in person was different. These weren't combat-effective troops anymore. They were walking corpses who'd somehow remained on their feet through sheer willpower. A court-martial was discussed but never proceeded with. Instead, arrangements were made to evacuate 77th Brigade to India. Calvert himself was evacuated to Britain on medical grounds after an accidental injury. He'd earned his second Distinguished Service Order and an American Silver Star, but the campaign had nearly killed him along with his men. By July 1944, it was clear the Chindits were finished as an effective force. Admiral Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, ordered medical inspections of the remaining brigades. The results were shocking, even to commanders who thought they understood the situation. In 111th Brigade, doctors examined the men and declared only 119 out of 2,200 fit for duty. Similar examinations of other brigades revealed comparable numbers. Roughly 90% of the Chindit force was non-combat effective due to disease, wounds, malnutrition, or exhaustion. Mountbatten ordered the immediate evacuation of all wounded and sick Chindits. The last Chindit forces left Burma on August 27, 1944, nearly 6 months after Operation Thursday had begun. They were supposed to have been relieved after 90 days at most. That was the maximum time Wingate believed troops could sustain operations under such conditions. Instead, many had been kept in the field for nearly 6 months, and the final weeks under Stilwell's command had been particularly devastating. Upon returning to India, roughly half of all Chindits required immediate hospitalization. Nearly all needed special diets and extended rest. The accumulated toll of disease, malnutrition, and stress had broken men physically and psychologically. Final casualty figures for Operation Thursday told a grim story. 1,396 Chindits were killed in action or died from wounds or disease. 2,434 were wounded. These numbers actually understate the human cost because they don't fully account for the thousands whose health was permanently damaged by their service. Chindit Syndrome became a recognized medical condition in post-war British military medicine. Veterans continued to suffer from chronic malaria recurrence, digestive problems from their bouts with dysentery, and various tropical diseases that would flare up years after the war ended. Many bore the psychological scars as well, what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The weight loss was staggering. Men who'd entered Burma at healthy weights emerged as walking skeletons. 3 stone losses, 42 pounds, were common. Some men lost a third of their body weight. Photos of Chindits at the end of operations show figures that look like concentration camp survivors. Gaunt faces with protruding cheekbones, skeletal arms and legs, uniforms hanging loose on shrunken frames. Back in Britain, as the Chindits began their slow recovery, the debate over their military value intensified. Mountbatten later said that ordering their disbandment was the most distasteful decision of his career. He had great respect for what the Chindits had endured and accomplished, but he couldn't justify continuing to operate such specialized forces when their tactics had been largely absorbed by conventional formations. Indeed, Mountbatten noted that the entire 14th Army had become Chindit-minded, adopting the aggressive patrolling, air supply techniques, and mobile tactics that Wingate had pioneered. In a sense, the Chindits had become victims of their own success. The innovations they'd proven were now standard practice throughout the Burma campaign, making a dedicated special force less necessary. In February 1945, the Chindits were officially disbanded. The men were reassigned to other units or sent home. The distinctive Chindit badge, the mythical lion that had symbolized their fierce independence, would no longer be worn in combat. But was it worth it? The controversy over the Chindits' military value began even before Operation Thursday ended and continues among military historians to this day. The question is deceptively simple. Did the Chindits' operations contribute meaningfully to Allied victory in Burma? Or were they an expensive sideshow that consumed resources better used elsewhere? General Slim's assessment was nuanced. He praised the Chindits' courage and endurance unreservedly. He acknowledged that their operations had forced the Japanese to divert troops to protect their rear areas. He credited Wingate with developing innovative air supply techniques that benefited all forces in Burma. But he also maintained that the Chindits' direct military impact was limited, and that the same resources deployed as conventional forces might have achieved more with lower casualties. Other critics were harsher. They pointed out that during Operation Longcloth, the railway sabotage was repaired within days and had minimal strategic impact. During Operation Thursday, the casualties were horrendous, approaching or exceeding 50% in some brigades, for gains that conventional forces eventually achieved anyway without such horrific losses. The misuse of the Chindits under Stilwell's command became a particular point of criticism, using forces designed for guerrilla operations as conventional assault infantry.
without proper supporting weapons, in battles for fortified positions, represented exactly the kind of misemployment that maximizes casualties while minimizing effectiveness. Many historians argue that had Wingate survived and maintained control of his forces, the casualty rates would have been significantly lower.
But there's another side to the argument. Supporters of the Chindit operations make several compelling points. First, the psychological impact was real and significant. After the disasters of 1942, British and Commonwealth forces desperately needed proof that they could fight Japanese troops effectively. The Chindits provided that proof. They demonstrated that British and Indian soldiers could not only survive in the jungle, but could operate offensively deep behind enemy lines. The morale boost throughout the British forces in India was substantial. Second, the Japanese took the Chindit threat very seriously. Post-war analysis showed that the Japanese diverted significant resources to dealing with the threat the Chindits posed to their rear areas. Japanese commanders committed roughly 20,000 troops to hunting and containing the Chindit brigades, troops that could have been used in frontline operations. In a theater where both sides were resource-constrained, tying down 20,000 enemy troops had real value. Third, the impact on Japanese planning and strategy may have been more significant than direct military results. The ease with which the British infiltrated Burma during Operation Longcloth convinced Japanese commanders that their defensive posture was untenable. This thinking contributed to their decision to launch Operation U-Go, the invasion of India aimed at Imphal and Kohima. That Japanese offensive proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The British held at Imphal and Kohima, and the Japanese suffered their worst defeat of the war in Burma, losing over 50,000 men. The Japanese army never recovered from this loss. Some historians argue that by triggering Japanese aggressions prematurely before the Japanese were fully prepared, Chindit operations indirectly contributed to this decisive Allied victory. Fourth, the innovations in air supply, casualty evacuation, and airborne insertion that the Chindits pioneered became standard practice throughout the theater. The techniques worked out painfully during Chindit operations enabled the 14th Army to be supplied during the Imphal siege and during the subsequent advance through Burma. The 1st Air Commando's light aircraft evacuation of wounded became a model for what helicopters would later do in Korea and Vietnam. Fifth, the Chindits proved that large-scale airborne operations were viable in jungle conditions. The successful insertion of 20,000 troops via glider and transport aircraft represented a tremendous achievement. While D-Day in Normandy gets more attention, Operation Thursday was at the time the second largest airborne operation of the war and demonstrated capabilities that would influence post-war military planning. Finally, there's the argument about Japanese communications and logistics. While it's true that railway damage was quickly repaired, the constant interdiction of Japanese supply lines had a cumulative effect. Japanese divisions in northern Burma frequently reported supply shortages. Their offensive operations were hampered by uncertain logistics. Attributing all of this to Chindit operations would be an overstatement, but the Chindits were certainly a contributing factor to Japanese logistics problems. Ultimately, assessing the Chindits requires looking beyond simple metrics of enemy killed or territory captured. Their value lay in a complex mix of psychological impact, strategic influence, tactical innovation, and resource diversion. They proved concepts that informed subsequent operations. They restored confidence to Allied forces. They diverted enemy resources. They provided learning experiences that benefited the entire theater. But they did all of this at tremendous human cost. Thousands of young men were killed or permanently damaged by their service as Chindits. Families lost sons, brothers, fathers. Even those who survived often bore physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that the Chindits were a bold experiment in unconventional warfare that produced both significant achievements and serious costs. They pushed human endurance to the limit and beyond. They demonstrated that conventional military wisdom about the impossibility of deep penetration operations was wrong. But they also demonstrated that such operations exact a price in human suffering that must be carefully weighed against potential gains. Today, the Chindits are perhaps less well known than other special forces units of World War II. The SAS, the Commandos, the American Rangers, these units tend to dominate popular memory. But within military circles, particularly in Britain, the Chindit legacy remains significant. In 2015, the British Ministry of Defence recreated 77th Brigade as a modern formation specialising in information warfare and strategic communications. The new brigade proudly carries the Chindit badge and name, connecting themselves to the legacy of those jungle fighters from the 1940s. Modern special forces, particularly units specializing in unconventional warfare and operating in austere environments, owe significant debts to Chindit operations. The concept of small, mobile forces operating deep behind enemy lines, sustained entirely by air, with specialized communications and support, this became fundamental to special operations doctrine in the decades following World War II. The SAS, which was reconstituted after the war, drew heavily on lessons from Chindit operations. Mike Calvert himself played a key role in reorganizing the SAS for counterinsurgency operations in Malaya in the 1950s, bringing his Chindit experience to bear on developing tactics for jungle operations against communist guerrillas. American Special Forces similarly studied Chindit operations. The U.S. Army Rangers trace part of their lineage to Merrill's Marauders, an American, long-range penetration unit that was directly inspired by and trained alongside the Chindits. Modern Ranger doctrine on long-range reconnaissance and raids owes something to the example set in the Burmese jungle. The air mobile concept, using helicopters to insert, supply, and extract troops in hostile territory, can trace intellectual ancestry back to the Chindit operations. While the Chindits used fixed-wing aircraft rather than helicopters, the fundamental concept of sustained air support enabling ground forces to operate far from conventional supply lines was proven during Operations Longcloth and Thursday. Every time a military force conducts an air assault into difficult terrain, supplies troops entirely by airdrops, or operates in small columns designed for maximum mobility, these echo the innovations that Orde Wingate and his Chindits fought to prove were possible. The men themselves never forgot what they'd been through. Chindit veterans formed associations and stayed in touch throughout their lives. Annual reunions brought together survivors to remember fallen comrades and share stories that civilians could never fully understand. These men had been through an experience that bonded them forever. The shared suffering of operating in the Burmese jungle created a brotherhood that transcended normal military camaraderie. Many Chindit veterans reported that nothing in their subsequent lives was ever as difficult as those months in Burma. They'd survived conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Whatever challenges they faced afterward, career setbacks, personal tragedies, health problems, they knew they'd already endured worse. That knowledge gave them a particular resilience and toughness that marked them throughout their lives. As we reach the end of this story, we're left with the complexity that surrounds any historical assessment of the Chindits. They were simultaneously heroic and tragic, innovative and wasteful, strategically valuable and tactically limited. They proved that conventional wisdom was wrong about deep penetration operations, but they also demonstrated why such operations are so costly in human terms. Picture one more time a Chindit column moving through the Burma jungle. The men are gaunt, sick, exhausted. Their uniforms are rotting off their backs. They're carrying loads that would challenge healthy troops over short distances, and they've been carrying these loads for months. Malaria shakes some of them with fever. Dysentery has weakened others until they can barely walk. Jungle sores cover their bodies, but they keep moving. The column pushes through the dense vegetation, each man following the man ahead of him, step after painful step. They're 200 miles from safety, surrounded by enemies, living on whatever falls from the sky. By any reasonable measure, they shouldn't be able to continue, but they do. That's the Chindit story, not the strategic debates or the historical arguments about military effectiveness, but the simple, extraordinary fact of human endurance. Men pushed beyond what should be the breaking point, yet continuing to function, continuing to fight, continuing to put one foot in front of the other. Whether the operations they conducted justified the suffering they endured remains debatable. Reasonable people studying the same evidence reach different conclusions. But what's not debatable is the courage, determination, and sheer toughness of the men who served as Chindits. They volunteered for a mission that many considered suicidal. They marched into the jungle knowing they faced an enemy that excelled at jungle warfare, in conditions that would test them as severely as any soldiers in any war. And they fought. For months, under conditions that would break most people within days, they fought. They raided enemy positions. They blew up railways and bridges. They ambushed convoys. They held strongholds against overwhelming attacks. They captured fortified towns despite being outnumbered and outgunned. And then, when their bodies finally gave out and disease and exhaustion had reduced them to shadows of their former selves, they marched out of Burma and went home. The Chindit badge, the mythical lion, fierce and proud, represents more than a military unit. It represents an idea. That determination and courage can accomplish things that seem impossible. That properly trained, properly supported troops can operate in the most hostile environments against determined enemies. That innovation and unconventional thinking can sometimes succeed where conventional approaches fail, but it also represents a warning that pushing human beings to their absolute limits comes at a tremendous cost, that the glory of military achievement is built on the suffering of individual soldiers, that strategic decisions made at headquarters have consequences measured in broken bodies and traumatized minds. Today, fewer and fewer Chindit veterans remain alive. The last survivors are now in their 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who can describe from personal experience what it was like to march through that green hell, to live for months on inadequate rations while fighting malaria and dysentery, to face the constant threat of ambush deep behind enemy lines. But their story deserves to be remembered, not sanitized or simplified, but in all its complexity. The bravery and the waste, the innovation and the tragedy, the strategic success and the human cost. The Chindits were neither the heroic supermen of propaganda nor the wastefully sacrificed victims of military folly. They were young men who answered a call to do something extraordinarily difficult, who endured suffering that most of us cannot imagine, and who left a legacy that continues to influence military thinking to this day. In the end, perhaps the truest tribute we can pay to the Chindits is simply to remember them as they were, soldiers who walked into the jungle knowing the odds against them, who fought with courage and determination against a skilled enemy in the world's most hostile environment, and who proved that human endurance, when tested to its limits, is capable of truly extraordinary things. If you found this story fascinating and want to hear more tales from the forgotten war in Burma, please like this video and subscribe to Whispering Wars. There are so many more incredible stories from this theatre. From the siege of Imphal, to the battles along the Irrawaddy River, to the final Allied advance that liberated Burma. Each one deserves to be told and remembered. Until next time, thank you for listening, and never forget those who served in the shadows of history.